I was rewatching this video I made a couple of years ago for reasons entirely unrelated to my being an egotistical maniac, and I was struck by a little epiphany that I feel is deserving of putting into words on the internet. Discussion surrounding law and the meaning of certain inclusions is pretty common in the Souls community, but I don't think I've ever heard anyone succinctly manage to explain the rift that seems to instantly open up whenever anyone begins overanalyzing things. I'm going to attempt to sew up this rift once and for all, and I'm going to do it by explaining why "it's just a game" is a dumb argument. Firstly, please don't leave. I recognise this is a somewhat odd take. Let me cook. So, to start, let's define what I mean by the "it's just a game" argument. I think the best way to explain this is through the example that I used in my very first video. This here is a pillar that can be found in Miquella's Haligtree in Elden Ring. As you can see, it has all sorts of interesting looking carvings on it. An individual on Reddit decided to try and assign meaning to these carvings, suggesting that perhaps this character represented Malenia and this character represented Miquella, etc. However, upon realization that this pillar was from an asset library, and that the original creation of this piece of art had no intended connection to the story of Elden Ring, his theories were instantly rejected. No longer could this pillar be used to extrapolate lore. It was, essentially, a thing made by the developer. It's just a game. Stop looking into it. There's no connection to Elden Ring at all. This Reddit's got quite the lashing for this from a lot of the community, including Vati Vidya. I'm sorry, right, this video isn't about Vati. I've already roasted him, I'm giving him a break in this one. Now, as a viewer of this video, I can understand why you might be slightly concerned, because "it's just a game" sounds like a pretty reasonable answer. These pillars obviously weren't made to depict Malenia and Miquella in the first place, and we can hardly extrapolate that every game that uses this asset has lore ties to Elden Ring, can we? So, why did I open this video by saying that this is a dumb argument? Well, to a normal, realistic human living in the real world, it isn't a dumb argument at all. It's possibly the most perfectly lucid stance to take. My issue with it is that it's being used outside of that context. The Souls community doesn't take the most perfectly lucid stance when discussing the lore of these games. We wouldn't be discussing the lore at all if that were the case. Look, let's take an example of a theory that is generally accepted by absolutely everybody. The Nameless King is Gwyn's firstborn. Right. Now, as we can see, clearly this can be proven by looking at this item description here, which... Actually, you know what? We don't even need to read it. Because that thing that we all call Gwyn, that's a fictional character in a video game. And he was created by a bunch of video game devs, and none of it really matters, and he doesn't really have a son, in the same sense that a string of binary numbers can't have a son, so it's pointless to extrapolate any theories from this. It's just a game. That, right there, is the infuriating argument of the perfectly lucid individual. A fun-sucking drone, entirely incapable of experiencing true art. I want to stress, nobody is that person. Nobody says that. No one is perfectly lucid. The fun of playing these games comes from pretending that it's real, trying to understand the story and characters by piecing things together that might not entirely fit at first. So, let's have some fun. Let's drop this perfectly lucid robot and start pretending it is real and start coming up with some theories. So, the Nameless King is Gwyn's son. We know that because of the spear that we see in the sunlight altars. Numerous item descriptions attest to this theory. Look at all those references on the wiki. Isn't it interesting to draw connections and lines between this stuff? I personally love learning about the lore of these games, and I can very successfully turn off that perfectly lucid drone bit of my brain that does technically know it is all just a game. I can still enjoy it. So then, the question inevitably becomes, what happens when we can see something in the game that we want to explain, but we can't necessarily do so through item descriptions. For example, this pillar here in the Haligtree. It depicts some characters, and let's say I want to know who these characters are. Well, unfortunately, now comes the time to put our toys away, I suppose. The perfectly lucid drone will be around any second now to explain this. Not using interpretations of the lore, but with that hard, cold knife that cuts through any amount of fun or imaginative musing you might have been having. It's just a game. It's just a game. Wait a minute. It's just a game? If it's just a game, then what was the point of all that speculation before? All those connections we were making, the lessons we were being taught. What's the point of it all if, with a single sentence, you can invalidate it entirely? You can't have it both ways. Gwyn is either the Nameless King's father or a line of code. If your brain wants it one way, you must disregard the other, or else the meaning of the story is instantly undermined. If you speculate and make theories about these games and enjoy delving into the lore and making connections and treating the world as if it was real, then you can't just turn around and invalidate a lot of it with the sentence, "It's just a game." This applies across the whole experience. If it's just a game, why are we talking? Either shroud yourself in the art or ignore it entirely. This is why there's so much disagreement in the discourse on this topic. A lot of people are taking the at first seemingly sensible argument that it's just a game, while others are trying to fully analyse the entire world as if it were real, and no one has ever bridged this gap. I'm hoping, if this argument convinces people, we can all agree that if we're analysing a game, it should be analysed in its entirety, and we shouldn't be tearing out the parts that we can't explain. To head off a potential counter-argument very quickly before I continue, I believe a response to this could be that, hey, you can have it both ways. Why not just turn off the perfectly lucid part of your brain when analysing things we can understand, and then just flick it back on when something doesn't have an easy-to-identify meaning? We can analyse Gwyn and the Nameless King and that theory, because there's lots of research done about it. And then as soon as something doesn't have that, we can just flip back to the "it's just a game." You absolutely can do this, but I would argue that having such a tenuous mental connection to the story, a tenuous enough connection to the point that you can just invalidate anything you observe with the single phrase, "it's just a game." Remember now, there's no line in the sand that's being drawn here that tells us when to stop using our imagination. There's no point in the game that you get to where it goes, "Hey, this is the point now where you just have to remember that we were doing our best and it's just a video game, so just ignore this bit." Anything, having that connection that's so weak, that potentially takes away from the enjoyment you might receive from imagining that it's real. Every time you say, "it's just a game," anything you previously enjoyed analysing flickers a little, because that's just a game too, until you force your brain back into imagination land. How many times can that enjoyment of the story flicker before it pauses entirely? I can't speak for myself, obviously, but personally, I would rather immerse myself entirely within the story, putting 100% of my trust in the artist that they have developed a believable, coherent world and story. Now, I'm not saying that this shrouding in art doesn't come with some truly horrible connotations. Some of us may remember the legendary Heineken label found in the gutter in Dark Souls 2. For those of us who have disregarded the "it's just a game" argument as an out, we must now undergo the excruciating process of trying to mentalise the image of the Emerald Herald knocking back a couple of Amsterdam's coolest brewskis. As awkward as it is, an earnest belief that this image isn't impossible is not something to feel shame around conjuring. Rather, it's a condemnation of the artists themselves that such a tone-warping suggestion could be implied. And by the artists, I don't necessarily mean the developers. Stepping back into our perfectly lucid brains reveals Dark Souls 2 to simply be a rushed game, made by people doing their best under very strict deadlines. When we analyse, the artists aren't necessarily just the developers, but publishers and platform hosters too. If Sony put pressure on FromSoft to release Dark Souls 2 by a certain date, and that pressure meant they didn't have time to scrutinise every inch of animation of sludge they were using in the gutter, then Sony have effectively marred the canvas. It doesn't mean that that's not there. It doesn't mean we don't acknowledge it. It doesn't mean we can't enjoy the rest of the art with it being there. And it certainly doesn't mean that we can tear it out and then turn and scrutinise others who haven't done that. Like it or not, those pillars in the Haligtree exist in the game. They might not depict Malenia and Mikola. They might not depict anyone from Elden Ring. They might have teleported in from Eora, for all I care. You can come to any number of conclusions, draw as many theories as you want, bang your head against the walls for decades trying to justify their existence, but what you cannot do is undermine the rest of Elden Ring by telling yourself that it's just a game.